I'll start recording. If you could just, if everyone could just make sure their mic is muted. Yeah, I can also mute them myself, but I think something like 5 people were unmuted. Okay, let me also share my screen. Okay. Yeah, sorry, with this new meeting, it's not automatically muting people's video or audio. So please turn off your video and your audio, especially the video, because that will increase the amount of bandwidth if the video is on.
What? There are already 21 people in here. Oh.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, sorry about that. We have to make a new meeting at the last minute. Please mute your microphone as well as your video.
Okay.
Sorry, in the future, it should automatically mute. We had to create a new meeting, so it's not going to automatically mute. So please make sure that the microphone in the video is muted. Okay, great. So hopefully you can see my screen now. And today we're going to go through the first lab, which is on Engram language models, which you just heard about in the lecture previously today. So this lab can be found, if you did the downloading script, you should have these 3 folders here, and click on day 1 LM, and then Engram LM lab. And then I'm looking at this Engram LMs.ipynb notebook. Please everyone just make sure your microphone is muted throughout. Okay, so now the first step of this lab is going to introduce a tool that we'll use at the end of the lab called CanLM.
Hello?
Everyone, please mute your video and voice. Normally, it should automatically mute. Since we created a new meeting, it's not automatically muting this time. Okay. Okay, so now the first step is to install this CanLM. Now you should have done this first step here already, so you can skip that. We did that during the setup. Or if you haven't done this install step, then do it now. So to do this, you click here, and then you open up a new terminal window like this, and then you're going to run these different commands here. So this command is going to install some Linux related libraries, and then these commands here are going to install this package called CanLM from this website. So in this terminal, if you can, just run these different commands. And after running these commands, if you go to your home directory, you should then see a CanLM you should see this CanLM directory here, and it should have this package downloaded and installed. Okay, so just due to time, I'm going to go ahead with the lab, and you could post any installation errors that you can get on CampusWire, and in the worst case, you could just watch along for this lab and then install this afterwards. Okay. My notebook running. Okay. So this will just install another small package. It should be quick that we use. And let's get started. So as we saw in the lecture before, in language modeling, we are trying to model the distribution of sequences, here denoted by W1 through WT. And we use this autoregressive factorization. And then as we saw before, in the case of these Engram language models, we assume that this joint distribution over sequences has this factorization here, where each conditional distribution only depends on the preceding n-1 words, right? So if you have a 5-gram language model, then it's only going to depend on the previous 4 words. So for example, if you're modeling this sentence here, the cat sat on the mat, and you have a 3-gram language model, then your model is making this assumption, which says that the probability of mat given the cat sat on and the is going to be approximated by just probability of mat given on and the. Okay, and then we call these 3 words here a 3-gram or a trigram. Okay. Now also, as we saw in the lecture, in order to estimate a model, an Engram language model, one way of doing it is just by counting the different occurrences of these Engrams. And so here's the whole derivation for how to do it. So if you have this Engram, which is, if you have this conditional, which is the probability of the next word given the previous n-1, you can just use the definition of conditional probability. And then you could follow along with these steps. Just due to time, I won't talk through them in detail. And at the end, you get this formula here, which is just the count of the entire Engram minus the count of the preceding n-1 terms. Okay? And so now in this lab, we're going to actually implement this. And since we're just counting words, you can just create a Python dictionary which maintains these 2 different types of counts for the numerator and for the denominator. So this is just showing what we'll do here. We'll have this Python dictionary called count for the numerator, and then a Python dictionary called total for the denominator. And just to start, we'll use this very simplified language, just so we can understand the concepts. Okay, so in this language, every word is going to consist of one of 3 tokens. So either A, B, or C. So this would be the vocabulary, is A, B, or C. And we're going to estimate a bigram model. So the probability of a sequence is going to be the product of these bigram probabilities here. And in this simple example, this is going to be our data set that we receive. So each line here is a sequence, and you can see that it consists of either A's, B's, or C's. And so this is kind of small data set where we just have 5 different sequences. Okay. Now, since this is a probability distribution, our model, if you remember back to probability, every distribution has to sum to 1 over all inputs. And it turns out that in order to satisfy that, we have to add these special tokens to each sequence. And it's one token which says this is the beginning of the sequence, and one token which says this is the end of the sequence. And so yes, there's a question here. Each row is going to be a sentence. And a sentence in our case is just some Okay, so now we add these beginning and end of sentence tokens, and our data set looks like this. And now we can estimate this bigram model. So again, we're just going to compute these two different counts, and then we'll be able to compute this probability here. And that's what this code is doing here. We're looping through the data. We're getting each Engram, and then we're incrementing this count, which says for a given prefix, which is this WT minus 1, and a given word, increment its count. And then for the denominator, we just increment the count of the prefix. Okay, so after running through this, we can see that, for instance, how do we read this? So for instance, given beginning of sentence, there's 5 occurrences of A, which makes sense if you look at our data set. Given A, there's 8 occurrences of A, but also some occurrences of B and end of sentence, which again, if you look at the data set, you can see that sometimes following A is B, sometimes an A follows, and sometimes end of sentence follows. So now that we have these two different dictionaries, we can actually see what these conditional probabilities look like. So that's what this is doing here, where we're saying what is the probability according to our bigram model of, for instance, A given beginning of sentence. And here it's just using the definition from above. So dividing the numerator by the denominator. Okay. Everyone just please make sure you're muted. Okay, thanks. And so for instance, if this is unclear, you can always, in the simple example, just go back to the data set and you can look at, for instance, probability of C given B should be 0.25. And you can kind of prove that to yourself by just counting yourself. So given B, look at all the occurrences of the next token, and 25% of the time, you should see that C will follow B. Okay, so now with the simple model, we can actually compute the probability of an entire sentence or sequence just using this formula here. So that's what this code here is doing. You're going to loop through this entire sequence, find the probability of each bigram, and then multiply it together to get some total probability. Okay, and so now here you could see that the probability of this sentence, AAB, is going to be this 0.07, and that's computed using these individual conditional probabilities. So this is a really simple example, but it kind of illustrates the same idea that you'll see in language modeling or in sequence modeling, where you have these different conditional probabilities that you're learning, and then you're able to obtain the probability for an entire sequence. And actually below, you typically take the log. So then you could sum the log of these probabilities rather than taking the product. And we'll actually do that. We'll actually see that below. So does anyone have any questions at this point? I guess not. So so now we'll go to a more realistic or complicated example. It's still a relatively small data set though. And we'll use this data set which is derived from different dialogues. So different people conversing. Okay, things are not clear. Is there anything specific that I should go back and clarify? Sorry, I guess I've been going too fast. Okay, sorry about that. So just to go back and review. So our initial goal is to build this language model, right? To model some sequences. And in this case of the Engram language model, we're going to assume that the sequences factorize into this distribution. And each conditional distribution only depends on the previous n-1 words. Okay, and so in this simple example here, we're going to learn one of these models or estimate one of these models. And it's going to be a bigram model, which means that the probability of each next word only depends on the previous word. It doesn't depend on 2 words before or 3 words before, etc. Okay, so that's our goal, is to actually estimate this model here, which is shown in this formula. And so in order to estimate a model, we use some data set. And so in this simplified example, this is our data set of different sequences. Okay, so here, for example, I'm highlighting is one sequence. And then here's another sequence in the data set. Okay, so now with these different sequences, it turns out that we have to pad them with these 2 different types of tokens. So a beginning of sentence token and an end of sentence token. This is so that, for instance, this first letter here, when you're modeling its conditional probability, you want the model to say the probability of A given something. So since it's the first letter of the sentence, you have to have some placeholder for something preceding it. This end of sentence token is so that when you encounter this B, you're actually modeling that after this B, the sentence should terminate. Okay? And so now, given this data set, in order to actually estimate the model, we use this counting formula, which we actually saw from the lecture earlier in the day. And it just amounts to going through this data set and counting on the numerator every unique or every occurrence of each bigram. So here I'm highlighting different bigrams that we'll count up in order to estimate this model. Okay, and now in the denominator, this is what we need to count for the denominator. And this ends up being equivalent to counting every unigram, every preceding word WT minus 1. Okay, so using this formula, that's how we're going to estimate this model. And that's what this code here is doing. Do we get probability for end of sequence? Yeah, so I could actually answer both questions at once. So you have to add this end of sequence to sort of model the fact that the sequence is ending. So for instance, if you look at this B right here, after this B, there's actually another B. The sequence is not ending. Whereas in this case, the sequence is ending after this B. So if we didn't have this end of sentence, there would be nothing to sort of represent the fact that the sequence is ending. I hope that clarifies things. Okay. And so this formula here, that's what this code is implementing. So first, we're looping over each sequence in the data set. Right, so the sequence will be one of these. And then this loop here, it's tricky to read out the exact code, but it's essentially going through and collecting each engram in the sequence. So the first occurrence will look something like this. The second occurrence in the loop will look something like this, and so on. Okay? And then this is just putting it into a variable. And now here we're calling the two different parts of the engram, prefix and word or next word. So in this case, with the bigrams, as we're looping through, say we get this bigram here, then the prefix will be this beginning of sentence, and the next word for that prefix is A. Okay, and then next time we go through the loop, it'll look something like this. So our prefix will be A, and then the next word will be A. And so yes, in the first case, the bigram will include beginning of sentence, but then in the second case, the bigram will look like this. And that's why it's called the bigram, is because it's only including two tokens. Okay. So now, so now we're doing this loop, right? And now we're going to actually implement this formula here. So this is saying the count of a given prefix followed by a word we're going to increment. So, for example, in this case, in the first iteration of the loop, it's going to count for beginning of sentence as a prefix and A as the next word. You're going to increment that count. So increment +1. Okay, then for the denominator here, we're going to increment the count of the prefix. So again, in the first case, the prefix will be beginning of sentence, and we'll increment that count. Okay, so then because of these two loops here, it's going to repeat this process over the set. So going through, collecting each bigram, and then incrementing these two counts. So after the process, we'll have these two different areas here, and that will be our model. That's the sort of estimation process for this model. And this line here. Yeah, so this is counting these prefix word pairs, and you could kind of read it as given some prefix, what is the word that follows it, and you're counting those. So, for example, given this prefix beginning of sentence, the word that follows it is going to be a, and so you're going to increment that count. Okay, and this is implemented as having a dictionary inside of another dictionary. Okay, and so now here you could see, after running this code, what do these different dictionaries look like? So, example again. So this is saying, given the prefix beginning of sentence, that the word a followed beginning of sentence 5 times. So that means that this count was incremented 5 times. Okay, and okay, so hopefully that makes sense. And the reason you could see that is if we go back and look at our you can actually count it yourself manually. So given beginning of sentence, A follows it 5 times. And for instance, B never follows beginning of sentence. So we don't see any counts for B in this case. Okay, and all the different rows here are the same idea, but for different bigrams. So in this case, it's saying that given the prefix A, the word A follows it 8 different times, whereas B follows it 3 different times. And again, here you can go back to the data set and try to understand this by even manually doing it yourself. So for instance, every occurrence of A, we look at its next word, and you can see that, well, let's count the B's because it'll be faster. You can see that in 3 different cases, the word B follows the word A. So here, here, and here. Okay. And so now, now that we have these counts, it's good to step back and remember why we got those in the first place. And the reason is that our model can now compute the probability of a word given a preceding word. And the way it does that is to use this formula. So to divide the count in the numerator by this total in the denominator. Okay, so now this, there's a question about the smoothing. That's a good question. In this case, we're just looking at the simplest possible Engram model. And so this model can actually have 0 probabilities, which is an issue. But here we're just trying to look at the simplest possible thing. And then below, we'll actually use a model that implements the smoothing. And just due to time, we won't explicitly show how to implement the smoothing. Okay, so the denominator is not the same thing as the vocabulary because it's counting the different occurrences. So it's saying for each word in the vocabulary, how many times does it occur in this bigram model? And in a different order of n-gram model, so if you had, say, a 5-gram model, then the denominator would be counting different occurrences of 4 grams. So those two things are kind of separate ideas. Okay. So now that we have these two different dictionaries, now we're going to actually implement this formula here, which is saying, according to our model that we've estimated, what is the probability of the next word given some prefix? Okay, and we're going to call this a conditional probability query. So we're querying what is the probability of the next word given a prefix. Okay, so in this code, we're going to make two different queries. So first, we're going to ask our model, what is the probability of A given beginning of sentence? And then in the next query, we're going to say, what is the probability of C given B? Okay, so now here we're just looping through each one. And we're going to get some prefix and some next word. And then here is finally where we're implementing this formula here. So we're saying that the probability is equal to this count of the word following the prefix divided by the total number of occurrences of that prefix. Okay, and then here, this is just some formatting to print out what is the probability. Okay, so it looks like there were some questions as I was explaining that. Let me see. Yeah, so I think Professor answered the one about the back off. Sorry, these are coming in quickly. Yes, and Shreyas put the formula there for how. Okay. So let's look at, after doing this estimation process, what does our model give us for these probabilities? So this is saying that following BOS, the probability of A is 1. Okay, so let's see if that makes sense. In this, we go back to our data set and count it ourselves and see if that makes sense. So again, here's our data set. And now following outcomes that occur in the data set, well, you can see here that 100% of the time, A is following beginning of sentence. Right? We never see beginning of sentence and then, for example, B. And so this sort of makes sense that our model has estimated this probability as 1.0. Okay? And so there's a question about these lines before the for loop. So this is, if you look at, maybe let's look at the output. So the output of the cell is printing out these two different probability queries, we're calling them. And so this up here is just defining what we see at the bottom here. So here is B and C, and you can see that this turns into the query probability of C given B. And it's reversed just because of the way that you write probabilities, I guess. Okay, so I can see how it's a bit confusing with reversing it, but hopefully this makes sense now that you can see that, okay, with B, C, that's saying that the prefix is B and the next word is C, and that corresponds to this probability. Okay. Yeah, I actually missed that question. I'm sorry. So maybe we'll ask that one on Campus Wire, because I'm not able to go back and look at the context for that question. Okay. It's a bit clearer that we have this model, and our model is learning these different conditional distributions. And here's 2 example conditional distributions. And now, again, we could take a step back and say, why do we care about having these different conditional distributions? Well, one reason is that using these conditional distributions, we can actually compute the probability of an entire sequence, so an entire sentence. Okay? And how do you do that? Our model is making this assumption that the probability of the entire sentence is the product of these different conditional distributions, right? So in order to compute the probability for the entire sequence, we're just going to multiply these different conditional distributions. Okay? So here we're going to look at an example. Here we have this sentence or the sequence that looks like this. Beginning of sentence, A, B, then end of sentence. Okay? And so now what this code here is going to do is it's going to loop through the sequence and look at each engram. So it would be kind of maybe confusing or tedious to exactly read out this code. Let me just show you what this code here is doing. It's going through the sequence as follows, like this. It's getting each bigram, one after the other. Okay? And so then again, we're going to call the beginning of the bigram as the prefix and the end as the word. And then this is the same code from above where we're computing this conditional probability. Probability of next word given the previous word. Okay? And now the difference with this code is that we have this multiplication. So we're maintaining the total probability and multiplying it by this probability of this new conditional. And this is implementing this formula here. Okay? And then here, this is just string formatting. And at the end here, it's placing the output of calling the sequence probability function. And so what we see in the end is that at each step of the loop, again, we're seeing a new conditional distribution, and we're getting its probability. And then at the end, we find that the product of all these different probabilities is here. And this is what we call the sequence probability. Okay. So let's see how, okay, so if anyone has any questions, you can ask them. Again, so this is just implementing this formula here. Okay. So what have we done? We've gone through on some data set here, and we've learned this bigram model. And the bigram model kind of gives us two different, or it gives us one thing. It gives us these different conditional probabilities here. Okay. Sorry, it wasn't working. And then using those conditional probabilities, we can compute the probability of a sentence. So now we're going to use the exact same idea, except in a more realistic setting. So now our data set is going to consist of kind of real sequences, which come from different conversations. So in this data set, two people would converse with each other, and the data set consists of different utterances. So an utterance is just a sentence. So for example, here's 3 examples from the data set. The first sentence is, "I'm doing great, except for the allergies." Second sentence, "I'm a woman, what about you?" Third, "I thought you were a college kid." So the whole data set just consists of, these kind of seem like things that people would say. That's actually how the data set was constructed, with just having people talk to each other. But you can see that this is very similar actually to what we did above. Now just instead of A, B, C, now we have actual words. And again, I won't step through the exact code of what this is doing. This is just loading the data set. And you can see that now this data set is a bit bigger. So there's 130,000 types of, 130,000 sequences. And our vocabulary size, so the number of different words, is 19,000. Okay, so before we had 5 training examples and our vocab size was 3 because we had A, B, and C. Now it's 130,000 and 19,000. Okay. So now with this slightly more realistic data set, we're going to also use a more sophisticated Engram model. So there's a question about this smoothing, and it was also mentioned in the lecture earlier. So an issue with the language model that we built above is that if a bigram or an engram didn't occur in the corpus, then when we multiply the different probabilities together, it would say that the probability of an entire sequence is 0. And that's kind of unrealistic because sometimes words don't occur in the training set, but you want your model to not say that the probability of the sentence is completely 0. Maybe it should be some small probability. So a technique to get around that is called smoothing. And so roughly speaking, smoothing will move some probability mass from things that do occur in the data set. It'll move that probability mass and kind of assign it to things that don't occur in the data set. And if that's kind of not a satisfying explanation, then there are details about this in the course lecture notes. And then if you want a lot of detail, you could read this this paper. But the lecture note gives a really good overview. And again, the smoothing, it may be important to understand, but it's not going to be used in the future neural models that we look at. So just due to time, we're not going to go into details. But with all of that said, we can still use smoothing. So we're going to use this package called KNLM, and this is a kind of well-optimized, well-developed Engram language model, and it implements something called this modified Kneser-Ney smoothing. Okay. So now with that said, if you were able to follow along with the installation instructions above, then you should have this directory called KNLM. So in my case, if I look here, I have this directory called KNLM. Okay. And so KNLM expects a certain file type. And so this cell here is just putting our data set, which we saw above, into the proper file format that's used by KNLM. So we can run it, and we can actually look at what it is. Okay, well maybe it's a large file. Okay, yeah, so here's an example. So it's essentially just putting each word separated by a space and then putting a new line after each sentence. So if you're gonna use KNLM for your own data set, you would have to do this tokenization step, or this pre-processing step, which puts your data into this form. Okay. Now, in order to run KNLM, we're going to use two different commands. So here is some kind of code that's maybe not not as readable. They also have instructions on the KNLM website if this gets confusing. But what this is essentially doing is it's saying, okay, we're going to learn three different models. We're going to learn a 2-gram model or bigram model, a 3-gram model, and a 4-gram model. And then here, this is running this command called lmplz, which actually estimates the language model using KNLM. And this is just setting up names for the different files. After this runs, there's another command which kind of packages the model into this binary file. So that's what this build binary here is doing. And then here, we're actually accessing the model that we learned through Python. Okay, so this command is going to create something called .klm, and then this here actually loads it into Python. Okay, so if we run this, there's a bunch of output, and this is KNLM output where it's estimating the different models. Okay, so that's how we're going to use KNLM. We're good, somewhat of a black box, but we could still ask, how do we evaluate this language model? How do we say that a language model, one language model is better than another? And to do that, we're going to use this metric called perplexity. And perplexity is computed using some data set, typically what we'll call this test set, and computing the following quantity. So given some data set of different sequences, the data set has a total length, which we'll call n total. Now, perplexity is defined as using this formula. So 2 divided by n total, and then the log probability of the entire data set. And so in order to understand this P of the data set, we have to go back and remember what does it mean to have the probability of a data set or the probability of a sequence. And the probability of a sequence is what we saw above. Right, this. So here our model is getting the probability of a sequence, and then taking the log, you can sum that over all sequences in the data set. Okay, so this metric is called perplexity, and it ranges from 1, which means you have a perfect model, to infinity, which means your model is poor. And intuitively, it measures what is the rank of the true next token. So if you look at one conditional probability, and you look at given some prefix, the distribution over next words, if you sort those by the model probabilities, then perplexity will give you, on average, where is the true next token. Okay, and again, I think we only have 5 minutes, but again, perplexity is discussed in the lecture notes as well. And if it's the first time that you're seeing this, it might be confusing, so please ask questions on Campus Wire, and hopefully we can explain. But so just to make sure we get through everything, here's the code that's actually evaluating perplexity. So maybe if the formula doesn't make, or in order to help understand the formula, you can always look at this code. So we're looping through the different sequences and summing the total log probability as well as the total number of tokens. And then doing this actual computation here. So this line here is actually the same as this formula. And there's this kind of trick that you have to do, which is KNLM gives us things that are in log base 10, but here we have to convert it to log base 2. Because if you look at this formula, it's log base 2. Okay. So again, just take a step back. Why were we talking about perplexity at all? Perplexity gives us some number to tell us how good our language model is. So we could compare different language models. So now here we see that the 3 different models that we learned, they have differing perplexity. So let's look at this on this validation set. We can see that increasing the Engram order of the model gives us lower perplexity, and lower perplexity is better. So now we have some numerical way of saying that this 4-gram model that we learned is actually better than this 2-gram model in terms of this perplexity metric. Okay. And now, similar to what we did above with our bigram model, we can again find these sequence probabilities. So here we're going to use log probabilities and just sum over. And so here, this is just looping through these different sentences. and saying for each different model that we learned, what is the log probability? And it turns out that KNLM actually has a function called score, which computes it for us. Okay, so now you could look at these different sentences, and for example, you could see that I like my pet dog has a higher probability than I like my pet zebra, because at least in this data set, it was kind of more common to have a dog following pet than zebra following pet, for instance. Okay, and it looks like zebra was actually more common than lion, because this I like my pet lion has an even lower probability. And then here's just some more examples. So here, for instance, if you look at this sentence, the 4-gram model has a noticeably different probability than the 2-gram model. And possibly one reason is that this 4-gram United States of America might have occurred in the corpus, whereas the bigram model is just treating this as a product of different bigrams. But if that's confusing, maybe the important thing is to see that the Engram order of the model affects what probability the learned model assigns to the sentence. Okay, so we just have 1 minute left. So hopefully this gave some overview, some concrete overview of things that we saw from the lecture, which is learning these different Engram language models through this counting estimation process. And so later today in the next lab, instead of doing counting, we'll actually take a look at having a neural Engram language model as well as a recurrent language model. So that's it for this lab, and please post any questions on CampusWire.